care that might invite the FTC to the table, and whether, not to put you on too many questions to you, but whether we think, I think one thing that we've spoken about it, PK has been active in talking about, is whether the FTC has enough authority and resources to do the work that it has, and then whether perhaps that needs to be expanded. I'm not asking you to opine on that, but give us industry view, please.
So NIST does terrific work, and I mean it's extremely accurate, it's very, very useful, and it's necessary work. I don't know how many folks in the room have actually looked through the NIST cybersecurity framework. Quick show of hands, anybody? A few people, okay, so you know that it's like 60 plus pages, right? That there's 120 or so different controls that are listed in the framework, tied to just a plethora of standards that themselves can run into well over 100 pages. For large companies, large enterprises, and these are the types of folks that I think have the resources to spend to go through all of that. And the framework itself also doesn't say, here are the things that you must do. It is, here are the things that you must consider in trying to decide which of these are right for your organization, and then just kind of right-size it and stay flexible. It's not a checklist. It's actually more nuanced, and therefore in some ways more difficult than that. I hope that it is being taken up by micro businesses, by consumers to manage their own cybersecurity, by companies that are outside of the United States, in particular IoT manufacturers that are using commercial off-the-shelf commodity products to build their IoT devices before shipping them out. But I have serious doubts that those types of parties are in fact using the NIST cybersecurity framework. And setting aside the NIST cybersecurity framework, consider also that there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of IoT security best practices out there for manufacturers and operators, for companies that are integrating it into their environments, as well as for consumers. I interned at the Federal Trade Commission in 2008, and so well over 10 years ago, and they had a long-running consumer education campaign about security, as well as a long-running campaign on small business security. These issues on a voluntary basis alone, I think we are starting to see that it is not working. And it's not working particularly at the low end of the market, right? You can expect better security in general, from name brands, from sophisticated devices. Nothing will be completely secure. You don't go out and find a news story that Tesla has security flaws, I know. But in general, they are not going to suffer from a lot of the same basic security flaws that you'll see in consumer products that are at the low end of the market that use those commodity products. And there are a lot of those. Probably the majority of IoT devices are those types of products. So what do we do about those if the voluntary best practices are not working? If NIST's great work is not being adopted by these parties, what do we do? And can we call that a market failure? If it is a market failure, then what is the role of government? From our perspective, there are things that government should be doing, and to some extent are doing, to address what we think is a market failure for those types of devices. There are several agencies that have put out voluntary guidance about their own, describing how IoT fits within their authority. And when I say voluntary, in some cases it's kind of in quotes, because they are still able to pull a recall of your car if your car has a cybersecurity defect that will affect safety. So they put out the voluntary guidance, but it's sort of like, look, these are the things that you can do, but if you don't do them, it's whatever, we're still going to pull your car if it has a safety defect. So NHTSA did this. The Consumer Product Safety Commission is starting to do this, but they did have a recall. It was just for something that actually caused a physical harm. The FTC is doing this for COPPA, so COPPA is for children's privacy, and it includes security requirements, so they put something out on that. But there are also the FDA, I want to mention also, the FDA has great guidance for medical devices pre-market, so before it ships, as well as aftermarket, so once it's actually out in the field. But there are a lot of gaps also. The Federal Trade Commission that Megan had brought up, they do have limited authority to go after core data security. But they don't have original finding authority, which means that you get your first bite of the apple almost free if you have core data security. The courts have also sort of thrown into question whether or not breach of information alone is enough to trigger that authority, or whether there has to be some sort of actual harm. So it's like, well, your nudes got leaked because of poor security on your device. And it's like, well, I can't prove that caused an economic impact to me, but it causes extreme embarrassment. extreme embarrassment, right? And it is a sort of thing that people do care about now. And but if you can't have a measurable financial or economic or physical impact, then the ability to actually require the company to change those practices from the FTC's perspective is limited. Same thing with their civil finding authority. So we have urged a couple of things. One, there's a big privacy debate that's happening now in Congress. It is far beyond IoT as it ought to be. We think that data security must be a part of that legislation. And one of the advantages to putting data security into privacy legislation is that it would be tied to a definition of personal information, not a definition of IoT. Earlier, you heard us describing about the difficulty of defining IoT, the fact that it's bound up in a bunch of other technologies, an ecosystem of technologies. And many of the things that we think of as IoT vulnerabilities are actually not related to the device. It's more like you've improperly configured your cloud storage. So that would help take care of that. We hope that that legislation would beef up the FTC's authority to regulate on data security practices without the limitations that I had mentioned before. And if they don't, I mean, if it's not, the states are in fact moving in that direction. Some 24 states do have data security legislation, but it varies on the details. Separately, we have said that agencies ought to all look at articulating how IoT fits within their authority, their existing areas of jurisdiction. There may be like some sort of impulse to say, well, there just needs to be a new agency that does everything on cybersecurity, and that's ridiculous. We have agencies that have deep domain expertise on things like cars, things like medical devices, and these are cars, these are medical devices. Just because they have internet in them doesn't mean that they're not cars or medical devices anymore. And then lastly, one of the things that NIST is doing, but we hope that it will be successful, is the idea of a label, the idea of some sort of transparency. Consumers do have a role in buying secure IoT and in maintaining the security of their IoT, and having some sort of a label, seal, transparency mechanism, whatever you want to call it, that lets consumers differentiate their products, not just based on cost, but also on security features we think will help them fulfill their role and their responsibilities. Thanks.
So one of the things that, so we didn't spend too much time talking about this, but Harley just mentioned it and it's discussed in our paper a little bit, is in order to have a label, you have to have something that qualifies to get a label. And so there's a process underway at NIST to develop a security capabilities baseline. That was an element that was concluded in the roadmap that we keep sort of referring back to. I think there's a sort of late summer, maybe sort of draft timing. There is legislation that's been proposed by Senator Warner, and I'm forgetting who his co-sponsor was. Gardner, to essentially require the capabilities baseline be developed to enhance for federal procurement purposes. I didn't get that exactly right. What we proposed in our paper is that something like that could then be followed on with a label that would attach to products that qualify and meet the capabilities. Because as Adam, I think, mentioned, the government is the largest procurer of goods at this point, and so if there is a sort of trickle-up effect, if you will, the rising tide lifts all boats idea that if the government is procuring products just like Energy Star that met a certain set of requirements, that would help lift industry and then thereby consumers as well. Well, we won't go too far down the road of that. I don't know if Harley wants to give something to add.
Just to note that the things that we're talking about are hotly debated right now, and the debate is happening now in Congress. So on a transparency label, or on government procurement, or on a security baseline for IoT devices, and some of the pushback that you're seeing, particularly from large traditional business trade associations, is that it can't be done. It's going to stifle innovation. It's impossible. We should just move on a totally voluntary basis. As I've tried to describe, I think that voluntary basis has failed, particularly for consumers and particularly on low-end devices. I also think that for the baseline that NIST is putting together, many of the items that will be in that baseline have been in best practices guidance documents for years. Like, we don't need another best practices document or another framework to say that if an IoT device is storing personal information, that information ought to be encrypted. We don't. We've heard for a long time that IoT devices need to have some sort of way to push security updates to the device. I'm very skeptical of the idea that another set of best practices is actually going to suddenly cause particularly again the manufacturers of low-end devices, to say, oh, we should probably include these in here because it's now in this new set of best practices, even though it's been going around for a long time. These are not just best practices for IoT devices, they're best practices for computer security in general.
So we've talked a little bit about what's been going on in the space, what are the security threats, particularly as it relates to IoT. We haven't spent as much time as I think we all intended to, speaking directly about how it impacts marginalized communities. But there are, as Harley and others have said, there's ongoing debate, there's an opportunity to get involved in the debate. I had a follow-on question, which was how can, particularly these communities, what advice will we give them to become, to get better involved in the conversation? But we'll save that in the event that we don't have any audience questions. Questions from the audience, otherwise I'll keep going. Anyone? Bueller?
I'll have a discovery today. One quick question, the Internet of Things, big things, automobiles. So the new generation of cars will be able to talk to each other. So one car will know that another car is coming through very fast and hit the brakes, but there's two evolving languages that they're talking. So it's a policy form. Should there be a policy to make one language instead of two? And second of all, how secure do you think it'll be that somebody else can't get in and talk to everybody's car?
So I'll try to sort of repeat the question, which was vehicles are, B2B, vehicle-to-vehicle communications are emerging right now. In fact, PK put a paper out about a year and a half ago, or some comments in the process that the FCC was leading. There are two different standards for communicating that are emerging. The question was, should there be a policy that dictates that there should only be one standard? And then the question is, how secure is this B2B communication? Anyone want to take that?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I can see both sides of it. On the one hand, I'm not sure whether it is, the role of government to choose the language that the two cars are speaking. I mean, that might be something that is better for the market to work out. In terms of whether everyone would be able to speak to every car, and that sounds like a really huge problem, and one that ought to be adequately addressed before it hits the road. I mean, it's not that it wouldn't come with safety benefits, but if the risks are severe enough, then I think that the technology needs to wait. But I'm sure that's being looked at and addressed. One thing that I know that is attendant to that problem is the idea of spoofing, right? Is they'll say, well, we'll fix the problem by just making it so that we're sure that the cars are only talking to other cars, and the other cars will have some sort of an ID number or something like that. Well, that ID can be spoofed, and a bad actor can say, well, I'm actually that car over there, and so forth. So it's a real problem. I don't think that there's necessarily a new law or regulation that needs to be put into place about it, because we already have anti-hacking laws and vehicle safety laws that I think would cover those scenarios. So I guess we'll see.
I think one of the questions too is whether the incentives, back to this question about what will it take for there to be, for vehicle manufacturers to ensure that they've done everything they can before they put the vehicle on the road. So Adam, not to that's a segue.
Sorry.
Did you have something to say?
No.
Okay.
I do, but that wasn't segue.
Okay. No, sorry. That's what I was saying. I wasn't saying.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know enough about the competing standards. I will say that a lot of times these things are sorted out through international standards bodies, and another role of NIST is to make sure that U.S. participation in those standards bodies is coordinated, and departments and agencies know what their role are. We participate in a lot of those international standards bodies as well. And I think that's also an important question here overall, right? Is we've talked a lot about what the U.S. is doing, but given that this is a global market and a lot of these devices are being made overseas, what is the rest of the world doing? And how can we have an impact on products that might be outside of the scope of our regulatory reach are also big questions that we think about. So we do look at what's happening in the international standards space quite a bit. We actually put out a report last year that tried to do a high-level analysis of where some of the gaps are. I think the communications, means of communications is another important topic here. And I think it's a good IoT example overall, right? Because you're going to have the cars communicating not just with other cars, they might be communicating with things on the highway. There might be a law enforcement component of that as well. We are seeing some of the impact of data localization laws back to this question of privacy, right? If you're looking at the old model and you're concerned about where data might be going, you're trying to set requirements or trying to put the power in the consumer to decide what you're doing, what something you own is doing with the data, you can start thinking about use cases with automobiles, made in one country, you're driving in another country, and the data's trying to make those sorts of decisions. You quickly get into a very, very difficult use case on when do you, as the person driving the car, do you have to, click on the windshield, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, yes, I agree. So those are the sorts of things that are breaking existing models and are other things that we have to think about.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask, what policies do you all believe you need to ensure that IoT devices that consumer services will receive security upgrades? Is that a thing that's being discussed?
So the question is whether over-the-air, so sometimes we call it updates to deployed IoT products, whether those should be automated or you should have the opportunity to opt out, or they. So I think Harley mentioned a little bit about that, but I don't know if there are others who want to.
Was that your question?
Yes.
Whether you can opt out?
Well, is there a policy
Is there
approach in
policy
place?
for enacting security upgrades with IoT devices? So as the side of the world continues to become more complex, that consumer devices will be able to keep up in terms of not getting hacked into or not being susceptible to data.
So the feature that you talked about a security update, we think is critical, and we think ought to be part of any baseline for IoT security without a very good reason not to. And because no matter how good your security is going to be, devices ship from the warehouse with bugs. There's millions of lines of code, even for very simple devices. There's actually a lot of complexity to them. And of course, more sophisticated devices, there's so many moving parts that there will inevitably be bugs. And so, even if you're going through secure development from the start, there will have to be some way to fix known vulnerabilities after it is already in the field. And the way that you do that is with updates. And there are several different ways to update the device. One of them, which is pretty old school, is used in infrastructure, is to have a technician physically on site to plug something in to deliver the update. That doesn't scale, right? That just does not scale in a consumer world. There's automatic updates, right? So that they just push it an update out, and you might think that that's the best way to do it, but there are some perils there. So one of the, I think it was WannaCry, the WannaCry attack, which is a malware attack that took out a bunch of hospitals. One of the problems that they had there was that it was taking advantage of an automatic update feature to infect different machines. But not having an update feature is the worst option, we think, because then you have vulnerabilities that stay, they don't get addressed, and there's almost nothing you can do about it except recalling the device. And that means contacting the consumer, making the consumer care enough to take out their device, send it back, and so forth. And this was one of the things that exacerbated the Mirai botnet. So the Mirai botnet was the one that involved a lot of internet cameras, took down critical infrastructure, information infrastructure in large swaths of North America and in parts of Western Europe. And it was exacerbated because they could not update those cameras. So yes, we think that it is really a very important feature, one that ought to be included inside of any baseline. And we think that baseline, there's a few more features that we think ought to be part of the baseline, but we think that baseline ought to figure into what agencies are saying, this is our expectation for IoT security, and we think that it ought to figure into what ends up being the reasonable security standard for personal information in any privacy legislation.
So in our paper, just to bring it back to a little bit to the cyber security shield, we said that essentially the ability to update ought to be a qualification requirement for a product that might be otherwise qualifying for the security shield label. And I think, Adam, I'm pretty sure that that's also part of the Warner-Gardner bill. And I think that's part of a few others that have been introduced. Anybody want to add on?
Yes, please. So one thing that we didn't kind of, because it takes a minute to talk about education and awareness, right? So that's a big one. I know that's a big one. So when we talk about small businesses, small, medium-sized businesses and micro businesses, I can't stress enough that I understand, I'm a computer scientist, I'm a software engineer, I understand security by design and privacy by design, absolutely. But the education awareness needs to be there. It's very anecdotal, but I do have people contact me all the time saying they bought this device, what should they do? They keep default passwords. So there's things, of course, we talked about that they need to do, but also to understand that the language needs to be clear. Right? So every time you open up an app or a device, they all have what we call EULAs, right? The end user licensing agreements. And most folks don't pay attention to it, right? You just accept or you hit it, yes, right? Whatever. You just click on, let me move on and try to install this thing, right? And I'm a computer scientist and I don't even understand the language, right? So it's one of those things that we need to, I'm loving the label idea and the security baselines and understanding. I mean, something simple where companies, especially small, medium-sized businesses and micro businesses, understand at least what the potential risks may be. And let it be there, like you said, to be able to discern, should I accept this risk or there's ways I can mitigate it and so on and so forth, because they are part of the supply chain, right? We talk about third-party risk, right? So these are things that we really need to just make sure we get the information out there, get the training. If you don't know where to go, if you're a small, medium-sized business or micro businesses, there's different organizations, not as many support, unfortunately, but there's like the Association of, I think, entrepreneurship opportunity. There's your local minority development business organizations that you have in the community. SBA, right, Small Business Association, they have some assistance as well and resources. So yes, you have to try to do your homework as well. So yes, thank you.
So I'll give a quick plug to two things. So first of all, the Global Cyber Alliance, the organization for which I now work, just released earlier this year something called the Small Business Cybersecurity Toolkit, Small Medium-Sized Business Cybersecurity Toolkit. It is pretty straightforward. If you go to Global Cyber Alliance, you can find it. And more importantly, or not more importantly, but equally as important, the idea or the need for awareness and education raising is part of this roadmap that we keep referring back to. I think it's important, though, to also remember that, first of all, there's only so much the government can do. They have limited resources, the budget keeps shrinking, so if we have some friends who have some spare change that they might help share with folks like NIST and DHS and others in this ecosystem, that would help a lot with the education and awareness raising. But there are a lot of companies that are also involved in this space, some of whom are very proactive in trying to enhance user awareness and education. Microsoft, I think, has been a supporter of PK, so has Google. Not to endorse them per se, but they are doing a lot to try and move the needle. There are others who are not, and I think from the consumer standpoint around the advocacy space, there's an opportunity to push corporations that are developing these IoT devices to be more responsible in their development and use of them. We have 1 more minute, so maybe we can do 2 questions. I think it's 1 more minute.
So I appreciate the panel's broad view of what's going on with IoT. I'm interested from a policy perspective, though. Do you see more focus, not on the federal level, but at the state and local level? Are there governors and local state entities that are looking at this as a practical issue they want to address because the feds are too slow and they're not doing it in a uniform fashion, hypothetically? Or are they waiting for the private sector to say, oh my gosh, we have to respond to something that happened? And if not, why not?
So,
30 seconds.
Right, I think everybody heard the question, which is what's happening at the state and local level around this. Are they waiting for the government to step in? Are they acting themselves? And I think I'll quickly answer the short version is a little bit of both. We've spoken a little bit about the work underway in a number of states around data breach and data security notification requirements. The National Governors Association has been active in cybersecurity.
What about IoT, not just cyber? Because cyber is
right. I think the answer to that I have is I'm not entirely sure, but the fact that I'm not sure is...
I can speak to it a little bit. So the main action is actually happening overseas. It's happening in India, China, and now the European Union. But if you're looking just at states, states are, in fact, looking at IoT-specific legislation. California already passed one. It comes online in 2020. It's tied in a weird way to the California Consumer Privacy Act, so there's a bit of limbo there. But it essentially says that you can't have you can't have default passwords that are shared across many devices. So it's essentially a unique default password requirement. To my knowledge, that is the first IoT-specific state legislation. 24 states have data security legislation, but it only applies to personal information. They all already have, all states and all territories in DC have data breach notification, and that's ineffective for other reasons we can get into later. Other states and other localities are looking at IoT. I heard that Houston, as an example, is looking at security requirements for their procurement of IoT as they rebuild post-Harvey. So yes, the federal inertia on this issue is leading to other entities, other states, locals, and particularly international governments to take charge.
I know we're running low, but just a 10-second add-on. I think a lot of them are looking at it in the context of smart cities as well.
Well, that is a wrap for us. I think some of us are sticking around for a few minutes, if not. You can find us, and thanks everyone. Again, thanks Elisa, and thank you to our panelists for joining us this morning. And to happier.
Thank you all. So I'm going to go over, we have some more people in here, so I'm going to go over the couple of housekeeping items one more time. If you want to see the agenda for today's event, you can go to our Eventbrite page. We have everyone's information listed there. At 12:40, we are going to break for lunch, and you can go have lunch in the cafeteria or somewhere nearby. Just make sure that you're back here by 1:40. And also, after we conclude here today, we'd like to invite you to our showcase and reception at the Google DC office, which is at 25 Massachusetts Avenue, Suite 900. And you can get there by walking. It's about a 15-minute walk, or you can take a ride share or a cab to get there. And again, I'm going to ask the PK folks to raise your hands. If you have questions, you can ask the folks that are raising their hands. Tara, Meredith, Chris. We have a lot of folks outside as well. And also be sure to use hashtag #TechForChange for all of your tweets. We want you to be engaged online. We are bringing in some more chairs in a few minutes. So if you are standing, then you will have a seat, or you can get the seats that are now empty. So I want to go ahead and introduce a special guest. We have Virginia Long-Abrams. She is a seasoned communications and public affairs executive with 2 decades of experience working in technology, media, and politics. She is the Senior Vice President of Communications and Government Relations at Starry, a technology company focused on reimagining and revolutionizing how consumers connect to the internet via Starry's groundbreaking 5G fixed wireless network. In her role at this company, Virginia advocates for and represents Starry in front of governmental agencies at the local, state, and federal level. And she engages with policymakers and the public interest community. She also leads media and analyst relations for the company, as well as the company's digital equity initiative, Starry Connect. And as you all know, all of these devices that we're talking about today, they don't work if we don't have the internet. So Virginia is going to be talking today about the importance of digital inclusion, making sure that everyone has access to affordable and robust broadband.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Thank you, Elisa, for that kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be a part of today's event, talking about all of these emerging technologies that, while nascent today, will become part of our daily lives in the not-too-distant future. When we talk about the potential for artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, or platforms that utilize virtual or augmented reality, we often overlook the one thing that enables access to all of it, the internet, or more importantly, access to the internet. I don't think there's anyone in this room that would disagree that access to affordable, reliable broadband is critical to our daily lives. And yet today, more than 20 million Americans still lack access to broadband, and millions more are underconnected in both rural and urban areas. These emerging technologies have the potential to affect positive social change and lift up marginalized communities, but they will never meet their full potential without ubiquitous, affordable broadband. Today, when we talk about broadband access, most people often associate it with cord cutting and the ability to Netflix and chill. But the truth is, internet access has become fundamental to participation in our broader society. Sure, you can stream great television shows and movies and make Instagram stories to your heart's delight, but broadband access enables all of us to do this and so much more. It's the bridge to job and educational opportunities, access to healthcare and social services. It even makes filing our taxes easier. And at a most basic level, internet access enables human connections to a wider community in the world around us. Electricity fundamentally changed our economy and how we live. Internet access is the modern equivalent. So how do we make sure all our communities are connected? How do we ensure that millions of Americans don't get left behind and are able to share in the benefits of broadband and all these wonderful emerging technologies? How do we narrow and close the digital gap? With technology companies like Starry, the way we deliver internet access to the home is changing, and that's a good thing. Starry is innovating wireless last-mile connections that reduce equipment and network deployment costs by nearly 100 times. Today, it costs roughly $2,000 to pass a home with fiber. With Starry's technology, that passing cost is reduced to less than $20. And we can connect homes and apartment buildings without having to tear up streets and sidewalks and without having to access public rights of way. The efficiencies we've built with our technology create massive cost savings for consumers, which is why we can offer both $50 and $15 service plans. So why does a company like Starry even care? Our company was built on the fundamental belief that connectivity is a social good. The more people that are connected, the better off our communities. But there's always been a massive imbalance in the internet service provider marketplace. More than 60% of our country has only one choice when it comes to broadband providers. And it's much higher when you get to the block and building level in each community. This massive market imbalance didn't feel right to us. And so we set out to build a technology that was cost efficient and could easily scale because fundamentally we believe that competition